On Press Perspective today, we turn the spotlight again onto South Korea's birth rate, which marked a tangible rebound last year as the country seeks to tackle the demographic decline within a silver society. Hello, welcome to Press Perspective for this Wednesday, May 6th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we touch upon South Korea's demographic portrait amid reports of a rebound in its birth rate and of efforts to raise the senior age threshold. Simply speaking, how old is old? For more on this, I have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid here in the studio. Raphael, welcome back.
Good to be back, thank you.
I also have Ruy Valdes with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Raphael, Ruy, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be here, Sonny.
Raphael, we start with you. First then, the rebound in South Korea's birth rate. It's been covered by quite a number of international media outlets, and you also wrote an article about this. Let's start off with your coverage.
Sure. So South Korea recorded 254,500 births last year, and that's the largest annual increase in 15 years. As a result, the fertility rate, which is the average number of babies that a woman will have during her lifetime, or at least expected, rose to 0.8 from 0.75 last year. So that's essentially the second consecutive annual rise, and it picked up pace faster than the projections expected. Of course, the story behind these numbers is what demographers are calling the so-called echo boomer effect. So essentially, back in the 1990s, you had a lot of people were basically born during that time, a spike in the number of people born during that time. Roughly 3.6 million children were born between 1991 and 1995. So, of course, these people are now in their early 30s and essentially of a childbearing age. Another factor is, of course, that during the pandemic, weddings, marriages were delayed, so that delay is now over and people are basically giving birth. So, of course, this rebound is, I think we can call it a bulge, so to speak, or maybe an uptick, temporary uptick. After this period where there was an uptick in birth, then it went back down. So, of course, demographers are expecting this to be a temporary phenomenon, and we'll have to see what happens later on. But despite all the good news, I think if we look at the OECD countries in particular, while this is good news for Korea, in the OECD countries, South Korea is the only one that has a birth rate under 1.0. So still a long way to go. So I think this is encouraging news, but the structural challenges maybe have not gone away.
Right, and before we delve into that, Ruy, you have a family here in South Korea. I wonder, do you perceive perhaps a shift in social attitude toward marriage and child rearing here in South Korea?
Well, actually, very in line of what Raphael was explaining, I would say that no. In general, when I meet other people with families, same thing, some studies that I will mention in brief. What we see is that still the focus on the concerns of people remain the same. One of them, the high cost of caring children in Korea. When you compare it to other countries, like France or US, is almost as double. One study made by the Ministry of Health here was pointing out that raising a child in Korea until the age of 18 costs like almost 8 times the per capita GDP. This means that you would need like 8 years of income, let's say the average Korean, to raise a child, while other countries like US will almost half of that you will need. So this remains a concern. Well, maybe I was a little bit too dramatic by saying no in such a dry way, there are some signs that this could be improving in relation to things like government policies. And but still, when the numbers that Raphael was mentioning were published, the officers that were in that conference, they also pointed out that it was too soon to tell if there was a correlation between the policies and this rebound in the birth rate. So we could say that there is a subtle change, but we cannot call it a real shift. I would say that the main concern, as I mentioned, is the cost of caring the child. And also, even though, for example, there has been an increase in the preference of marriages, it's still higher than the preferences to have children. So those things not necessarily are always the same. People can get married, but at the same time decide not to have children. We will talk more in detail later on this, but yeah, that will be in a nutshell.
Ruy, you mentioned government policies aimed at encouraging couples to have children. Could you tell us a bit more about some of the examples out there to support child rearing then here in the country?
Yes, well, this considered by the government by some years now as a national emergency, the government has been focusing in policies to find a better work-family balance, promote childcare support, and housing assistance, interpreting that these are some of the main factors that cause couples or people to decide not to have children. This has amounted more or less an investment of 19.7 trillion won, showing the scale of the effort. And one of the main points that seems to have been having some effects, at least even in the surveys when people are asked about this, is parental leave. So more and more men are taking also leave during when their mothers have, or their wives or their partners have children. This has augmented in the latest years. The 2025 Women's Economic Activity Report, also promoted, sponsored by the government. They say that the number of women taking career breaks fell 9.9% in 1 year. As opposed to some parents that have increased. So in that sense, it seems to have been working, but still, as we have been mentioning, all these results have to be taken with caution, because if we go to the data, we see a rebound, but not necessarily a sustaining trend.
Right. Raphael, beyond government policies here in Asia, there are companies that are offering their workers some perks to encourage them to have children or to start a family. Could you walk us through some of these offerings, if you will?
Sure. Yeah, we have governments across Asia that are pouring enormous sums of money into these pro-natal policies. For years, these have been quite limited in their effects, but we also now seeing a growing number of billionaires as well, and major corporations are deciding to take matters into their own hands. Of course, in South Korea, some of the most maybe eye-catching examples come from the corporate world. We have, for example, Krafton, the gaming company known for PUBG, which offers employees a lump sum of 60 million won, which is about $43,000 per birth, and then they give additional payments continuing until the child reaches the age of 8. Then, of course, I think probably the most famous example is the construction firm Buyong, that goes even further by paying 100 million won per birth. That's around $70,000. And they are even floating the idea of plans for tax-free housing for families that have 3 or more children. In China, we're also seeing similar moves. The dairy giant Yili Group announced a fertility subsidy program worth around $235 million, while retail billionaire Ye Guofu set up a marriage and childbirth fund that distributes wedding gifts and baby bonuses to employees. One energy conglomerate, the Far East Holding Group, has also gone to prioritize hiring graduates who promise to essentially have large families. In Hong Kong, Trip.com founder has also personally pledged 500 million Hong Kong dollars to a foundation that gives these baby bonuses to PhD students, basically understanding that these people in the future basically are a bit strapped for cash. So I think the question, of course, is whether this will actually work. Can these bonuses help, or do we still have the underlying problems that we've been mentioning and Ruy has also been talking about?
Right, I suppose time will tell. Back here in South Korea, Ruy, I wonder, do most pundits believe that this rebound in birth rate here in the country is just a temporary phenomenon?
They would say that with the information available, it seems it would be temporary, but they are not discarding that this could become a trend. That would be the conclusion, taking into account everything mentioned in the previous questions. What the pundits also point out, basically as a list of things that they have to be addressed, and the government is actually trying to address, is to be seen if it's going to work the way they are doing it, but it's a high housing cost, expensive private education, job insecurity among young people, workplace culture that still penalizes parents. And I want to make a stop here because, yeah, that's one of the main points that are discussed in surveys and studies. Is also the career interruption for women when they decide to have a kid. This fear of getting lagged in what you could call the ladder in their office or their company when they try to get back to work. So even if they take the maternity leave and then come back to the office, they face many obstacles for them to keep climbing, or they get lagged in comparison to men that stay at work because they didn't take the leave. In that sense, I also wanted to comment some personal experience when I just arrived in Korea. This is more to think about how we are talking about Korea right now. And as we were saying, if we compare it to OECD countries, Korea is right now a rich country. That doesn't mean all the results are necessarily bad. If you compare it, for example, my home country in Mexico, for some years ago, I remember when I arrived, you have a bigger disparity in wages between men and women in Korea as compared to Mexico, which sounds, well, kind of surprising, right? But when you go to the absolute income of both, of course, South Korean women are making more money. They can afford more things, which make them, which give them the possibility to decide, okay, maybe I make much less than men, but I have enough money to decide to live on my own. That is actually a positive thing, and it's a phenomenon you can see in other developed countries, which sometimes as a result comes with the declining of the birth rate. What we, or what Korea needs to address well is how to make this attractive enough, so yeah, like women also can reduce disparity, can reduce this lag in the climbing of this ladder, so that it become worth it in their own terms to have children. Of course, men also taking parental leave and other factors that we have been mentioning.
Right, for sure. Moving forward, Raphael, a recent survey shows that more than half of Koreans support raising the senior age threshold here in South Korea. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular survey and its broader implications?
Yeah, so this is a survey by Gallup Korea published last week, and it found that 59% of South Koreans support raising the age at which people qualify for senior citizen benefits from 65 to 70. 30% opposed the change and 12% were undecided. But the poll itself covered just over 1,000 people and asked a wide range of ages, and the support was relatively consistent throughout. Approval ranged between 55 and 65% regardless of age, and the one group, I think this is really interesting, the one group that you might expect to be the most resistant were people in their 60s, and still came out at around 55% in favor of this change. So I think to understand what's going on at the core of this matter is the current threshold of 65 of course, it unlocks a wide range of benefits. The most visible one is, of course, free subway rides, and that policy has been going around for quite a long time now, and I think it was put in place in 1984 roughly. But back then, people aged 65 or over, they just accounted for roughly, I think it was 4% of the population, and that figure has climbed to roughly 20% now. So, of course, the policy is designed for a small elderly minority at the time, but now, of course, things have changed and they are taking up a lot more of the resources, you know, and there's a huge financial burden on the working population. So, of course, this, I suppose, support for changing the age has been going on for some time. The support, at least, has been going on for some time. In similar surveys in 2015, only 46% supported the change. By 2023, it had risen to 60%, and ever since, it's essentially stayed roughly at the same point. I think there's also something telling within these figures. 60% of the respondents said individuals should be primarily responsible for financing their own future, as opposed to 29% pointing to the government and society. So I think there's also an indication that Koreans are thinking about sustainability and of the welfare state as the population essentially ages at the moment.
Right. And I wonder, Ruy, this debate over how old is old, how is this debate unfolding beyond national borders?
Very much in line as in Korea right now. Well, I'm speaking globally, so what I did was going to OECD report, so I'm talking about those countries, but that you could easily compare with South Korea. They are all facing very similar dilemmas. Basically, people are living longer, but birth rates are remaining low. And this report was interesting because it said that before, let's say 3-4 years ago, when you made a forecast on demographics, there was always positive scenarios, no? That somehow the birth rate was gonna rebound for a long term, but this doesn't seem to be happening. So this report says that basically all the optimistic forecasts did not happen. So people have, governments or countries need to be seeing this as a big problem, that they cannot rely only on demographics to fix it. They cannot say, well, all of a sudden, or thanks to these policies. So one of the things they are discussing in all these countries is exactly what Raphael was saying, that what if we augment the retirement age? But of course, again, we entered the debate like you were saying, how old is old? What does it mean to retire at the age of 70 in terms of health, in terms of other things that you will need to preserve, let's say productivity, updating if technology changes, etc., etc. So the pushback remains, but we could say it's a debate ongoing internationally. And yeah, Korea, in this sense, is not unique, and yeah, is facing this common situation.
Right. Raphael, in the meantime, what are your observations here in the country as South Korea seeks to navigate a low birth rate amid a rapidly aging demographic?
Yeah, I think for me, probably the biggest thing that I take out of these stories that I see in the news, and also speaking to friends around me, is, you know, of course, this kind of paradox that the birth rate is slightly going up. And I think there is genuine political will from the government to, you know, put some spending into trying to solve this problem. But then when you look at the physical infrastructure that families actually depend on, I think it's quietly going down, maybe in the opposite direction. Just last year, 89 pediatric clinics across the country closed their doors. And you know, that closure rate for the pediatric clinics was the highest among all medical specialities. Basically, more are closing than are opening. And then when you look across the country as well, delivery facilities, especially in the non-capital regions, are slowly declining or diminishing. In some places have no delivery facilities at all, and families and women are forced to travel long distances just to give birth. And again, the delivery facilities are focused near the capital areas of big cities. So that's one issue. And then I think there's also the general kind of generational expectation that comes with giving birth. When you ask young people, young Koreans, how many kids do you want? If you do the average, it comes to around 1.8 or 1.9 people. I mean, of course, you can't give birth to a decimal, but that's the average. And yet, as we've discussed, the birth rate is 0.8 at the moment. So I think there's a gap between what people want and what is actually happening. So maybe this isn't necessarily about people not wanting to give birth, but there are clearly other barriers. And I think many of the barriers that people talk about a lot these days are, the housing issue, job security, childcare, healthcare. These are all things that people keep on talking about as maybe some of the reasons. Of course, there are a million other reasons, but some of the core reasons why maybe giving birth in this country is not the best possible situation for, well, at least perceived to be for some people. So, yeah, again, the structural conditions I think are extremely important.
Right, keeping in mind the hurdles that Raphael has just enumerated, Ruy, here's a million-dollar question. What do you suggest for South Korea as it seeks to maintain its rebound in birth rate?
Well, making child rearing less financially overwhelming for the parents. We know in South Korea, expenditures, especially in private education, are quite high, and competitiveness doesn't seem to be reducing. So that would be one. Make work and family truly compatible. This means culture is also very important. We can make all these laws, all these policies, all this support, but if the perception of people is still conventional in the sense of men and women, father and mother, that could still affect the situations in the workplace. Expand practical support, like we didn't have time, but they are doing in Korea, like a public kids cafes, they call here, these playgrounds, usually indoor, for kids to play, and parents don't have to spend a lot of money because the private ones are usually quite expensive. But the main point and the main concern is that, being all that said, we need to prepare for a low fertility future anyway.
Right, that is true. That is the sad truth, of course. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Ruy, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you, Sunny.
Raphael, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.